Ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow citizens, thank you for being here today. I must tell you the truth as clearly as possible. What lies ahead is not merely another recession. What is coming is far worse, far deeper, and far more transformative than what most policymakers, media commentators, and even economists are willing to admit. This is not about a single downturn in the economic cycle. This is about a structural crisis and unraveling of the very foundations of our global system. And unless we wake up, unless we change course, the consequences will be unprecedented in modern history. We are entering an age defined not only by economic contraction, but by geopolitical fragmentation, ecological collapse, and social disintegration. The mainstream debate keeps asking, will there be a recession? That question misses the point entirely. What we face now is systemic. The institutions that sustained stability for decades, the international order, the financial system, the balance of power are breaking down before our eyes. When most people hear the word recession, they think of a temporary downturn, a few quarters of negative growth, maybe higher unemployment, and then eventually a recovery. But what I am warning you about is something categorically different. This is not a routine fluctuation in the business cycle. It is not a passing storm that will soon give way to clear skies. What is approaching is a systemic crisis, a structural unraveling that goes far beyond the mechanics of GDP reports or stock market indices. And if we continue to treat it as a conventional recession, we will miss the gravity of what is truly at stake. The illusion that this is just another recession is dangerous because it comforts policymakers and misleads the public. It allows leaders to believe they can tinker with interest rates, print more money, or pass another stimulus package and somehow stabilize the system. But the foundations of the system itself are eroding, and no short-term policy fix will address that. That we are living in a global order built on unsustainable consumption, reckless financial speculation, and a political architecture that is outdated and unable to manage 21st century realities. When the foundation cracks, patchwork repairs are meaningless. Imagine a dam breaking. It is not enough to seal one leak when the entire structure is collapsing under pressure. The truth is that we are facing what could be described as a convergence of failures. The financial system is over-leveraged. Governments are drowning in debt, and yet trillions are still being funneled into speculation rather than real investment in sustainable growth. At the same time, the inequality has reached staggering levels, hollowing out the middle class and fueling social unrest. When families cannot afford housing, when wages stagnate while corporate profits soar, when basic health care and education are out of reach for millions, what you have is not merely an economic problem. You have a system that is failing its people. That kind of failure cannot be measured in quarterly GDP, but in trusts, stability, and legitimacy on. And here is the hook that should keep every citizen awake at night. The next crisis will not simply be about jobs and markets. It will be about political order, about whether democratic institutions can survive under the weight of broken promises. We have already seen the rise of extremism, populist movements, and polarization across countries. These are not random political swings. They are symptoms of a deeper structural breakdown. When the economic system no longer delivers stability and opportunity, politics becomes radicalized. And when politics radicalizes, governance itself becomes paralyzed, creating a vicious cycle that accelerates collapse. Consider also the international dimension. The United States, Europe, and China are entangled in economic rivalries that are not simply about trade disputes, they are about who controls the future. Global supply chains, technological innovation, energy dominance, all of these are battlegrounds in a competition that risks spiraling into confrontation. A simple recession is contained within borders, but a systemic crisis is global, spreading across economies like a wildfire that respects no national boundaries. The 2008 financial crisis taught us this, but what is brewing today is even larger because it is not confined to finance alone. Now imagine trying to manage this structural breakdown with the same old tools, cutting interest rates, raising them again, passing stimulus checks, imposing tariffs. These are superficial responses to deep fractures. It is as if a doctor prescribes painkillers for a patient with organ failure. Yes, the pain may temporarily subside, but the underlying problem worsens until it becomes fatal. And that is where we stand today, a global economy on life support, while its leaders insist the patient just has a mild fever. This is why I emphasize so strongly that what is coming is worse than a recession. Recessions end, they have recoveries. A structural crises, on the other hand, transform societies. They force nations to redefine their priorities, to rebuild their systems, or to risk collapse altogether. What we are entering is not the end of a cycle, but the beginning of an era of reckoning. And if we do not confront it with honesty, clarity, and courage, we will be swept away by forces far larger than any central bank or government stimulus can control. The world is being pushed into a dangerous era of confrontation, and the geopolitical tensions unfolding today are not temporary disputes that will simply fade away with a change of leadership or a new treaty. They are structural conflicts rooted in power, resources, and ideology, and they are accelerating at a pace that should alarm every citizen. The rivalry between the United States and China is now defining the global stage, and it is not merely about tariffs, technology, or trade deficits. It is about who controls the architecture of the 21st century. This rivalry is reshaping alliances, fracturing institutions, and destabilizing regions that once appeared relatively secure. The risk is not just that it will damage economies, but that it will ignite crises far more destructive than any recession. Look closely at the signals. The decoupling of supply chains, the competition over advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence and semiconductors, and the militarization of the Indo-Pacific are not isolated events. They are all part of a strategic contest, and the costs are already spilling into the global economy. Every disruption in trade, every sanction, every retaliatory measure erodes trust and increases uncertainty for businesses and workers alike. But more importantly, These moves set the stage for something even more perilous, a world split into rival camps, with each side demanding loyalty and punishing neutrality. That is not just geopolitics, it is the slow dismantling of globalization itself. Here is the hook. Imagine a global economy forced into two competing systems where countries must choose allegiance as if it were a Cold War redux. The difference this time is scale. China is not the Soviet Union. It is an economic powerhouse integrated into every supply chain, financing infrastructure around the globe, and holding massive influence in international organizations. If the world fractures along these lines, the cost will not be limited to slower growth. It will mean entire regions locked out of opportunity, nations forced to align not because of choice, but because of survival. This is not theoretical. It is already unfolding in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, where countries are being pressured to pick sides in technology, infrastructure, energy deals, and security arrangements. Add to this the wars already draining resources and destabilizing entire continents. The ongoing conflict in Europe is not only devastating Ukraine and Russia, it is reshaping NATO, altering energy markets, and destabilizing food supplies that ripple across Africa and the Middle East. The Middle East itself remains a powder keg with shifting alliances, fragile ceasefires, and external powers manipulating conflicts for strategic gain. Each of these crises on its own would be enough to rattle the global system. Together, they form a chain reaction of instability. And once such a reaction begins, history shows us it rarely stops at the first explosion. What makes this even more dangerous is the psychology of escalation. Great powers rarely step back voluntarily once they have committed to confrontation. Pride, domestic politics, and the illusion of control push leaders to double down, even when the costs grow unbearable. We saw this dynamic in World War I, where nations stumbled into catastrophe because they believed they could manage escalation. We see echoes of that today as military exercises, sanctions, and rhetoric create a climate where miscalculation could trigger a disaster. And unlike the 20th century, the world now holds far more destructive technologies, making the stakes incalculably higher. If you want another hook, consider this: every dollar spent on confrontation is a dollar not spent on sustainability, health, or education. Every soldier deployed is a worker not building infrastructure. Every rivalry pursued is an opportunity lost for cooperation against climate change, pandemics, and poverty. Geopolitics, in its current form, is not just destabilizing the international order, it is robbing humanity of the very resources we need to survive. And yet, leaders frame confrontation as inevitable, as though we have no choice but to march toward division. The reality is that this geopolitical confrontation is not simply another issue on the global agenda. It is the multiplier of every other crisis. It turns financial instability into a global contagion. It transforms climate breakdown into a security threat, and it transforms inequality into mass migration and political collapse. To pretend this is just a matter of foreign policy misses the larger truth. This confrontation will shape every aspect of our future, from the prices we pay at the grocery store to the security of our democratic institutions. The stakes could not be higher and the warnings could not be clearer. The geopolitical landscape is shifting at a speed that even seasoned observers find unsettling. And the reality we must face is that the confrontation now unfolding is far more dangerous than a simple diplomatic quarrel or trade dispute. What we are living through is a structural conflict between great powers, with the United States and China at the center, and it is creating ripple effects across every continent. This rivalry is not about minor disagreements over tariffs or market access. It is about the architecture of the 21st century, about who sets the rules, who holds the power, and who shapes the future. When such contests escalate, they rarely remain contained, and the world today is standing on the edge of a geopolitical transformation that will affect economies, societies, and security systems in ways most people are not prepared to grasp. The first sign of this shift is the slow but deliberate decoupling of economies. Supply chains that once linked the world in a web of interdependence are now being pulled apart by political decisions, security concerns, and rising distrust. From semiconductors to rare earth minerals, from energy infrastructure to digital networks, both Washington and Beijing are seeking dominance, not partnership. These choices carry enormous costs because a world that was once integrated is now fragmenting. And when integration collapses, efficiency collapses with it. The ordinary worker will pay the price through higher costs of living, disrupted employment, and shrinking opportunities. This is not simply about global GDP slowing. It is about the reordering of the global economy into rival camps where trust is replaced by suspicion and cooperation by confrontation. Here is the hook that should focus the mind. Imagine a world not of one global marketplace, but of two competing systems, each demanding loyalty. The United States and its allies on one side, China and its partners on the other, with smaller nations forced to pick sides whether they want to or not. We are not speaking here of the Cold War's ideological split, but of a material fracture that could affect everything from the price of your smartphone to the flow of food and medicine. China is not the Soviet Union. It is an integrated economic giant, commanding vital infrastructure projects from Africa to Asia through the Belt and Road Initiative. Forcing nations to align could lock entire regions into dependency and rivalry for decades. The cost of this fracture will not just be economic, but political, as neutrality itself becomes a dangerous position. And while this rivalry deepens, wars are already destabilizing global order. The conflict in Europe continues to drain resources, fracture alliances, and drive energy and food crises that spill into Africa and the Middle East. In the Middle East itself, shifting alliances and chronic instability are inflamed by external powers pursuing narrow interests. These conflicts are not isolated. They interact with the US-China rivalry, amplifying global instability. Sanctions imposed on one side ripple into commodity shortages on the other. Energy routes disrupted in one region trigger inflation halfway across the globe. The global economy is now a tightly interwoven machine, and war in one corner sends shockwaves everywhere. What makes this confrontation especially dangerous is the psychology of escalation. Great powers, once locked in a contest, rarely retreat gracefully. National pride, domestic politics, and illusions of control push leaders to double down, even when it is irrational. We saw this in World War I, when nations stumbled into catastrophe because each believed escalation was manageable. The echoes are haunting today: military posturing in the South China Sea, technology bans escalating into trade wars, and sanctions multiplying into retaliations. Each move increases the chance of miscalculation, and miscalculation in a nuclear armed world is not a risk humanity can afford to take. Another hook is the staggering opportunity cost of confrontation. Every dollar spent on arming, sanctioning, and posturing is a dollar taken from solving humanity's real challenges: climate change, public health, education, and sustainable development. Every new submarine built is a school not constructed, a hospital not funded, an investment in clean energy postponed. Confrontation is not simply dangerous in a security sense, it is draining the resources needed for survival itself. Yet political leaders present this rivalry as inevitable, as though humanity has no choice but to sacrifice its future on the altar of great power competition. And so the confrontation becomes a multiplier of every crisis we face. Financial instability becomes global contagion. When rival powers weaponize currencies and trade, climate breakdown becomes a trigger for conflict. When water and food scarcity are exploited for political leverage, inequality and poverty become flashpoints for migration and radicalization. When nations use vulnerable populations as pawns in geopolitical struggles. To frame this simply as foreign policy is to miss the truth. This rivalry is shaping the very conditions of global life, from the prices in local markets to the survival of democratic institutions under pressure. The world must understand that this confrontation is not temporary noise, but the new background music of international politics. It will define the trajectory of the global economy and global stability for decades to come. The warnings are there, the signs are visible, and the stakes could not be higher. This is not the kind of rivalry that ends with a handshake. It is the kind that redefines history. And unless we change course, we risk being dragged into a future shaped not by cooperation and progress, but by division, insecurity, and loss. The global economy today is being held together by illusions, and the danger is that those illusions are beginning to collapse under their own weight. People are told that inflation will come down, that interest rate adjustments will stabilize markets, that recovery is just around the corner. But the deeper truth is far more unsettling. The economic system itself is no longer functioning as it should. We are living in an era where speculation outweighs production, where financial engineering matters more than real investment, and where the gap between the markets and the real economy has grown so wide that it threatens to swallow stability altogether. This is not a matter of one downturn or one crisis cycle. It is a matter of systemic rot. When we look at the financial landscape, the evidence is clear. Asset prices have been inflated by years of cheap credit, and central banks have fueled bubbles by trying to sustain growth through monetary tricks rather than genuine reform. Trillions of dollars are tied up in speculative activities, derivatives, hedge funds, complex instruments that produce little to no value for ordinary people. Meanwhile, infrastructure crumbles, wages stagnate, and inequality soars. The illusion is that these markets represent wealth, but in truth, they represent fragility. The larger the bubble, the more catastrophic the burst. And here is the hook. We are not asking whether the bubble will burst. We are asking how much damage it will do when it inevitably does. Think of the way governments and institutions talk about growth. They speak in percentages, in quarterly reports, in stock market rallies. But ask an ordinary worker whether their life has improved, and the answer is often the opposite. Costs of living rise faster than wages. Debt burdens grow heavier. Home ownership drifts out of reach for younger generations. The disconnect between what the data says and what people feel is not accidental. It is the direct product of an economy that rewards speculation and punishes stability. This gap between perception and reality is unsustainable when enough people stop believing in the promises of the system. Trust collapses, and once trust collapses, recovery becomes almost impossible. The illusion also extends to how governments manage crises. When markets wobble, central banks rush in with liquidity injections, bailouts, and emergency lending. These measures create the appearance of stability, but they are like a doctor pumping adrenaline into a patient without treating the disease. The system staggers forward, but each intervention makes it more dependent, more fragile, and more vulnerable to the next shock. After 2008, the world promised reforms, yet here we are again with even larger debts, even more complex financial instruments, and even weaker buffers against collapse. History is repeating itself only on a grander scale. Here's another hook. What happens when the next major shock comes, but the tools we relied on no longer work? Interest rates are already stretched between extremes. Governments are already burdened with record debts. The financial sector is already overleveraged. There is no cushion left. What we are left with is an economy living on borrowed time, dependent on the belief that tomorrow will somehow be better simply because yesterday was survivable. But belief cannot substitute for reality forever. And then there is the question of inequality. In a healthy economy, growth is shared, wages rise with productivity, and opportunities expand. In today's economy, wealth is concentrated at the top, with a handful of corporations and individuals capturing a staggering share of global resources. This concentration is not only unjust, it is destabilizing. When people lose faith that hard work can deliver a better life, when they see billionaires multiplying fortunes while they struggle to cover basic expenses, the social contract breaks down. And broken social contracts do not repair themselves. They explode into political extremism, unrest, and division. The illusion that the market will take care of everyone eventually has been exposed as false, and the anger this creates is boiling across the globe. consider also how fragile the global supply chains have become. The pandemic revealed that just in time systems and hyper efficiency models are brittle when tested by real world shocks. Yet, instead of building resilience, many economies doubled down on financial speculation, leaving the structural vulnerabilities unaddressed. What happens when the next disruption hits, whether from war, climate, or another pandemic? The cost will not be measured in market losses alone, but in empty shelves, lost jobs, and lives appended. And yet the illusion persists that these are rare, one-off crises rather than the predictable consequences of a brittle system. We must also confront the reality that the financial sector has grown too powerful. Political systems, instead of governing markets, are governed by them. Every policy decision is judged by how markets will react the next morning, not by whether it serves the long-term good of society. This inversion of priorities is at the heart of the illusion. The market has become the master and government's its servant. But history shows us that when finance rules over democracy, collapse is never far away. The most dangerous illusion of all is the belief that recovery will look like the past, that another rebound, another bull market, another cycle of growth will restore what has been lost. But this time is different because the structural weaknesses are not cyclical, they are foundational. The system is cracking under the weight of speculation, inequality, and unsustainable practices. To treat this as though it were just another dip in the cycle is to ignore the very real signs of systemic decay. The greatest danger facing humanity is not simply economic mismanagement or political rivalry, but the accelerating collapse of the environment that sustains us. For decades, scientists have issued clear warnings, and yet leaders have responded with half measures, delays, and distractions. Now, the consequences are no longer distant projections, they are present realities. The Earth is heating at record pace. Glaciers are melting, seas are rising, storms are intensifying, and food systems are under siege. What makes this crisis different from past challenges is that it is not confined to one region or one sector. It touches everything: economies, politics, security, and health. And here is the hook: we are running out of time to act, and the costs of inaction will not be gradual but catastrophic. Consider food security, rising global temperatures, and shifting rainfall patterns are reducing crop yields in key regions. Droughts are crippling farmers in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, while floods devastate entire harvests elsewhere. Each disruption drives up prices in global markets, sparking unrest and migration. When families cannot afford bread, when children go hungry, when governments are unable to subsidize food imports, political instability follows. Hunger does not remain an agricultural issue. It becomes a catalyst for protests, uprisings, and even war. The illusion that climate change is only about weather misses this fundamental point. It is about survival and stability. Water scarcity is another ticking time bomb. Rivers are drying, aquifers are depleting, and glaciers, the source of drinking water for billions, are shrinking at alarming rates. Nations that once cooperated over shared water resources are now edging toward confrontation. The seeds of conflict are already visible in disputes between India and Pakistan, Ethiopia and Egypt, and across Central Asia. Wars of the future may not be fought for oil, but for water, the most basic element of life. Imagine a world where rivers run dry while populations grow. This is not science fiction, it is an imminent reality. Climate disasters also impose crushing economic costs. Hurricanes, wildfires, and heat waves destroy infrastructure worth billions in days, sometimes hours. Insurance companies pull out of entire regions, leaving communities unprotected. Governments sink deeper into debt as they rebuild again and again. And yet, the cycle never ends because the underlying problem, greenhouse gas emissions, remains unaddressed. The hook here is clear. The global economy is bleeding from climate wounds, but instead of healing, we keep applying bandages to stop the bleeding while the injury spreads. What is striking is how environmental collapse interacts with other crises. Rising sea levels threaten to displace hundreds of millions of people, creating refugee flows larger than anything the world has ever seen. Where will these people go? How will nations respond when their borders are tested not by a few thousand, but by millions seeking survival? The political strain of migration will deepen polarization, fuel extremism, and strain democracies to their breaking points. This is not speculation. It is the predictable outcome of ignoring environmental warnings. The illusion that technology alone will save us is also dangerous. Yes, innovation matters. Renewable energy, carbon capture, and efficiency improvements are essential. But technology cannot substitute for political will. Clean energy is expanding, but fossil fuels are still being subsidized on a massive scale. Forests, the lungs of our planet, uh, continue to be cut down for profit. We celebrate minor victories while losing the war. The gap between what is needed and what is done grows wider every year, and the longer we delay, the harder the transformation becomes. There is also the health dimension. Rising temperatures are expanding the range of deadly diseases. Mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria and dengue are spreading into new regions. Air pollution from fossil fuels is already killing millions prematurely. Heat waves claim thousands of lives, disproportionately affecting the elderly and vulnerable. The climate crisis is not only an environmental issue, it is a global public health emergency unfolding before our eyes. And here is perhaps the most sobering hook. Unlike financial or political crises, environmental collapse does not allow for quick resets. You cannot negotiate with melting ice sheets. You cannot pass legislation to reverse ocean acidification overnight. Once thresholds are crossed, they cannot easily be undone. The stability of the climate system is like a delicate thread. Once it snaps, the unraveling accelerates, and we are pulling that thread faster with every year of delay. The environmental breakdown is not a distant future. It is here, shaping the present and accelerating every other crisis. What is coming is not just worse than a recession, it is a test of whether civilization can adapt before nature forces its own verdict. The warnings are undeniable, the stakes immeasurable, and the time dangerously short. The greatest danger before us is not any single crisis in isolation, but the convergence of all crises at once, feeding each other in a cycle that grows harder to break the longer it continues. Economists, politicians, and media outlets often analyze challenges as though they exist in separate boxes: an economic downturn here, a geopolitical conflict there, a climate disaster in another column. But the truth is that these crises are interconnected, and when they converge, they amplify one another. The hook is this: we are not facing a sequence of problems to be solved one at a time, but a storm of intertwined crises, each one making the others worse, pushing the world toward a reckoning that feels increasingly inescapable. Think of how economic fragility interacts with politics. When inflation rises, when jobs disappear, when families struggle to pay rent, political institutions come under immense pressure. People lose trust in leaders, in experts, and in the very system meant to serve them. That loss of trust then fuels polarization, populism, and extremism. In turn, political instability makes it harder to enact policies that could stabilize the economy, creating a feedback loop of dysfunction. This is not theory. It is happening right now across continents, from strikes and mass protests to collapsing coalitions and polarized parliaments. The cracks are visible. And here is the deeper warning: once trust is lost on a large scale, recovery is not measured in quarters or even years. It can take generations. Layer on top of this the geopolitical rivalries between the world's great powers. The US-China competition, war in Europe, and turmoil in the Middle East are not distractions from the economy. They are direct threats to it. Sanctions, trade wars, and disruptions in energy supply have already destabilized markets and driven up prices globally. War in one region fuels inflation in another. Strategic competition over semiconductors or rare earth minerals disrupts entire industries worldwide, and each geopolitical move escalates the risk of miscalculation that could trigger broader conflict. The economic and political costs of these rivalries are measured not only in lost output, but in lives destabilized, opportunities foreclosed, and futures compromised. Then comes the environmental dimension, which does not simply add another problem, but multiplies all existing ones. Extreme weather destroys crops, driving food prices higher, which feeds inflation, which deepens political anger. Drought forces migration, which creates social and political strain, which in turn fuels nationalist movements and border conflicts. Rising seas threaten to erase coastal economies, forcing governments into perpetual cycles of rebuilding, debt, and instability. The climate crisis is not a backdrop. It is the stage on which every other crisis now plays out. Ignoring it while focusing only on short-term financial or political concerns is like treating the symptoms of a disease while ignoring the organ failure underneath. Another hook worth holding on to is the way inequality supercharges this convergence. In times of abundance, inequality may be tolerated, though never justifiable. But in times of scarcity, inequality becomes combustible. When elites profit while ordinary citizens suffer from inflation, energy shortages, and climate shocks, anger spills into the streets. Social unrest, protests, strikes, and even uprisings become more likely. And once unrest begins, political systems struggle to contain it without resorting to force, further eroding trust in democracy and opening the door to authoritarian alternatives. This is not a forecast. It is history repeating itself in real time. The convergence also accelerates because leaders continue to respond piecemeal. Economic crises are treated with monetary fixes, political crises with rhetoric and posturing, environmental crises with symbolic gestures. But piecemeal responses cannot match systemic problems. When all crises reinforce one another, narrow solutions only shift the pressure, never resolving it. Imagine plugging holes in a sinking ship one at a time while new ones keep opening. The inevitable result is collapse. Yet leaders insist on managing symptoms instead of addressing the structural causes: overconsumption, reckless speculation, unsustainable energy, and the absence of genuine international cooperation. Here is the sobering reality. Humanity is now facing what could be described as a polycrisis, where the whole is far more dangerous than the sum of its parts. An economic downturn on its own can be painful, but survivable. Geopolitical rivalry on its own can be tense, but containable. Climate shocks on their own can be devastating, but manageable. But when all these forces collide simultaneously, they push societies to breaking points. The strain is visible in failing states, in collapsing trust in institutions, in mass migration, in growing extremism. And once that strain reaches a tipping point, the possibility of systemic collapse becomes real. The hook that should alarm everyone is that convergence accelerates unpredictably. A drought in one region triggers food shortages that drive political unrest in another. A financial shock in one economy cascades into debt crises across dozens of others. A regional war disrupts energy supplies, sparking inflation and political backlash thousands of miles away. The interconnectedness of our world means that no crisis remains local anymore. Every shock becomes global, and when multiple shocks hit at once, the world system lacks the resilience to absorb them. The warnings are not hypothetical. We are already seeing the outlines of this convergence: rising food prices driven by both war and climate shocks, a mass protest sparked by inequality and inflation, political paralysis fueled by polarization, escalating rivalries, consuming resources that should be directed toward sustainability. The storm is not on the horizon, it is overhead. And the question is how long before it breaks in full. What is coming is not merely a downturn or even a series of crises. It is the convergence of forces that together are pushing us toward a global reckoning. When we talk about what is coming, we cannot limit our imagination to the idea of a typical recession or downturn. What lies ahead has the potential to be far more destabilizing, because it touches not only on economics, but on the very social fabric that binds societies together. The deeper danger is that political institutions and democratic norms, already fragile in many countries, may not withstand the mounting pressures of economic shocks, global conflict, and environmental stress. History has taught us repeatedly that when societies feel cornered, when people cannot feed their families, when trust in leadership evaporates, when anger becomes the dominant political emotion, democracies falter and authoritarianism gains ground. That is why this moment carries the weight of something much darker than a financial cycle. It is a test of whether our political systems, our social contracts, and our collective values can hold under strain. War. The hook here is that institutions built to manage normal times may not be equipped to handle extraordinary times. Democracies thrive when there is a baseline of stability, when debate and compromise can function within shared trust. But when crises converge, soaring inflation, collapsing currencies, mass migration, global rivalries, then the ground beneath democracy shakes violently. Leaders desperate to maintain control often resort to emergency powers, censorship, or crackdowns, eroding freedoms in the name of stability. Citizens, frustrated by gridlock and disillusioned by elites, may welcome strongmen who promise simple solutions. And once that cycle begins, it rarely ends with restored democracy. It ends with institutional decay that can last for generations. Consider the role of media in this fragile landscape. In an era where misinformation spreads faster than verified truth, polarization intensifies, economic fear is easily weaponized into political narratives that divide citizens into camps of us versus them. Instead of addressing systemic issues like inequality, debt, and climate vulnerability, public discourse is consumed by blame, scapegoating, and ideological warfare. This not only paralyzes decision making, but also accelerates the collapse of trust in institutions. And without trust, even the best policy responses fail because citizens no longer believe or cooperate with leadership. That is how societies unravel, not because solutions don't exist, but because the political and social cohesion needed to implement them collapses. Another hook is the danger of global power vacuums. As established powers struggle with internal crises, their ability to maintain international stability weakens. This opens the door for regional conflicts, opportunistic aggression, and the erosion of the international order itself. When the frameworks that guided trade, diplomacy, and security begin to fracture, nations retreat into narrow self-interest. Alliances weaken, cooperation fades, and competition intensifies. In such a world, even small sparks can ignite large-scale conflict. A financial shock in one country becomes a global panic. A border clash becomes a regional war. A climate disaster sparks migration that destabilizes multiple governments at once. The interdependence of today's world magnifies the consequences of every misstep. It is crucial to understand that what is coming is not only external, but also deeply psychological. Societies under prolonged stress experience fatigue, cynicism, and despair. When optimism erodes, when younger generations see fewer opportunities than their parents, when middle classes shrink and poverty expands, then the cultural glue that binds a nation begins to weaken. This psychological erosion is as dangerous any economic metric because it makes citizens more vulnerable to demagogues, conspiracy theories, and movements that thrive on fear rather than hope. The collapse of faith in a better future has always been the precursor to political instability and violent upheaval. At the same time, we are entering an era where technology amplifies every tension. Artificial intelligence, social media, and digital surveillance offer both opportunities and dangers. They can empower communities and connect movements for positive change, but they can also be weaponized by states and corporations to manipulate, control, and divide populations. The unsettling truth is that the same tools that could help humanity navigate crisis more effectively may instead accelerate authoritarianism, propaganda, and social breakdown. The battle for the future is not just over resources, but over information, perception, and control of narratives. The sobering hook is this: the danger ahead is not merely economic pain, but systemic breakdown. A recession is temporary. A depression, though devastating, is still an economic condition. But what we are confronting is the potential unraveling of governance itself. If nations cannot adapt quickly, if they cannot prioritize cooperation over confrontation, if they cannot rebuild trust between citizens and institutions, then the cost will not simply be measured in lost GDP. It will be measured in lost democracies, lost freedoms, and a lost sense of shared humanity. That is why this warning must be heard clearly, because what is coming could redefine the very order of the world, and whether it leads to resilience or collapse depends on choices made now, not later.